Okay, we are going to continue with the digital painting demonstration and caricature. And just to review and to keep myself grounded in what I'm doing, I have the handout that's available to you through links in Canvas, the digital coloring and painting primer right here. We are getting away from just digital coloring behind finished outlines, and now we are working on digital painting. So we have a few different ways of approaching it. First with sketches, or first just with shape painting, and different ways to finish it off as well. So I can refer back to that. What I did in the last demo is I showed you just a generic face template, right? So now we're going to use photo reference, and I'm going to be doing caricatures of these four faces. And what I am thinking of when I look at them is how they match the facial template and how they deviate, you know. Especially kids' faces might be a little bit broader and rounder at top and then pointier at the bottom. Their jaws are not as long because the teeth are not as big. Adult faces, they have different shapes, you know, broader shapes, longer shapes, square, rectangular, oval, heart-shaped, all of that. So I'm going to be playing with that, but then applying this same basic template, which has the eye line halfway in between. So what do? Well, I open up my reference, and it's great to have multiple references of each face you're drawing, but here I just have one, but for four faces. And then I'm going to create a new Photoshop file. Your reference doesn't need to be any particular resolution. But my digital painting file does need to be a high enough resolution for printing. So I'm going to make it my standard size, about 11 by 14 inches by 350 pixels per inch. RGB, the white background. And now I want to be able to see my reference at the same time as I'm painting. So what I'm going to do is swap them that way, select my painting, go to Window, Arrange, and say 2 up vertical, because my caricature is going to be a vertical caricature. That way I can have these two windows side by side. I want my caricature surface to be larger than my reference. So if I select my reference, I can shrink it, I can zoom in and move around. So I think I'll start with their faces. And another trick I might do once I've built my white space is I can select all of my caricature reference, copy it, then paste it as a new layer here. And I'm going to go ahead, even though this lessens the resolution, I'm going to go ahead and make it bigger. Because I'll show you, we can draw, but we could also trace basic shapes if we need to, right? So that's there if I need it. That background is going to be just a white background, just like digital coloring. I am going to not touch it. So that's my paper white. So I'll double click it in order to name it, and then I will lock it so I can't accidentally paint on that white layer. This is my photo reference, but I also have that photo reference open in another Photoshop file so I can see it while I'm painting. I'll have that turned off for now. Then I will have a layer we haven't done digitally before, a sketch layer. And that's where I start. So looking at the handout we have here, this is like when doing the apple. We have to sketch out the proportions and the shape of the apple. Now there are a few different ways we can approach this. So some people like to sketch not with lines and not with kind of structure and templates, though I'll recommend that for caricature. But there is another approach called speed painting, which is just based with shapes. So let's get right into it. With painting, we use the brush tool. We almost only ever use the brush tool. And to start, we could just use typical brushes, usually with a tablet. And so I'll use these two brushes mostly, just starting out. They are pressure sensitive to scale, right? And I'll use them at 100% opacity, 100% hardness, or a 0% hardness, you'll see the difference. So let's just play with those brushes really quickly. I have to pick a color, so let me just pick a random color from here. It goes into our foreground color selector. And so this one is 100% hard, a size of 300 pixels with opacity of 100%. If I press lightly, it barely fills the circle. If I press harder, it fills it all the way. Right? What if I do that exact same brush? These are the middle two default brushes, and I take it to 0% hardness, still 100% opacity. I do the same thing. You see that it changes for size, but the edge quality is very different. And if I zoom in on that, you can see that the edge quality between the two, here you have the circle kind of scalloping because it's 100% hard edge. And here you have a very gradated edge, which is allowing that white background to bleed through. Okay, now the other brush we might use a lot are sensitive not to scale, but to opacity. So if I start with 0% opacity and I use this one at the very end of the top row of the default brushes at 100%, same size, and I put that next to the one I did, if I press lightly, it will be very low opacity. If I press harder, it will be full opacity. So I basically did the same thing I did there, but with a different brush. Notice the size stays consistent, but the opacity changes. This is actually a good finishing brush, but almost never at 100% hardness. So if I do that same approach at 0% hardness, this is what you get. And so that's actually the same size all the way through, but it's so low opacity at the top here that you barely see the edges of it. Okay, now the problem with both of these brushes is they're just circles. What if we use those brushes in combination to make our own kind of brush? So let me see, let me start with this one. And let me make a little brush like so. Okay, and then if I soften it, fill in between a little bit. Then what if I work with this one, give it some polka dots. Okay, so now this is what you would call a custom brush. So how do I make that work? Well, what I can do with that layer is go to Edit and say Define Brush Preset. So now if I define the brush preset, it will take that brush that I've just made on that layer, and I can give it a name. So that's the name of the file that this is, but I can just say this as a brush temp test. I say OK. Now if I go to my brushes, at the very end of my brush options, I have this brush. And now I can paint with it. I can scale it to different sizes. Right? So that's that brush at a much smaller size. And if I draw with it, you see what happens. Now how can I make that brush sensitive to scale or sensitive to opacity? Well, now I need to go into better brush options. So these are just your regular brush options, but then we have over here what are called your brush presets. Right? So these are all of the palettes, and now let's set an option to this brush. So I'm on my new brush that I created. The ones I like to play with the most, they start kind of with the top. So shape dynamics, go ahead and click on that. And then, like using layer styles, you can modify your brushes. So do I want it to change in size? Yes. I actually want it to jitter. So as I'm using it, I want it to slightly change size. So it's not just an even line. Instead, I want it to look more like a pencil or something, like a broken edge. You see that? So it's getting a little bit smaller, a little bit bigger. So I'm going to change my size jitter. If I do that a lot more, it will vary the size a lot more. But I'll put mine maybe about 50%. How do I want to control that, the size of it? Well, pin pressure. That's why I use a tablet. So if I barely touch it, it will be small. If I push hard, it will be big. So I get that pressure sensitive to scale. This is going to be my sketching tool, right? If I don't want to use a regular pen or pencil. Angle jitter. Now what you'll notice is that the brush is always the exact same orientation. Whereas if I had an actual bristle brush, as I turned it or twisted it, the bristles would move. So I can imitate that even if I don't have a tablet that allows me to do what's called a tilt and twirl sensitivity. I can change the angle jitter so that it rotates as it goes. So you can see that down here with the sample. As you move it, it will rotate. I try not to go too crazy with this, but you'll see how the brush changes angle now as I use it. So it looks like a more even random line, you know, a more organic. Then there's the roundness jitter. Do you always want the edges to be perfectly clean, or do you want them to kind of round out and simplify a little bit? And so I'll put a little bit of that on there. Now for the angle jitter, I can also control that. If you have this capability with your tablet, which I do with this Intuos tablet, I can actually base that on my rotation or on my tilt. So as I tilt the brush, it will angle with me. Right? Or I can just leave it to do it itself automatically. So it's always even. So shape dynamics is a huge controller. Now, what if you want some more specialized effects? Let's clear all of this. If I want to scatter, if I want kind of an airbrush, I can use these scattering options, and I can decide how much I want it to scatter, how multitudinous I want the scattering to be, and how diffused and different. And so even if I have a small brush like this, if I have that scatter option, I could fill up a whole field with it. This is good for kind of pattern-based brushes or texture-based brushes. You know, there's still, I have the shape dynamics turned on, but you can see how with a lot of pressure filled up, it doesn't fill it up with one brush stroke, instead it scatters it. So it's like changing a gun into a shotgun. Then if I turn that off, all those options go away. Texture, if I want it to look a little bit more broken up, I can turn on texture dynamics and I can play with those. And this will actually sharpen all of the edges a little bit. See how I have that soft opacity built into my brush? But with the texture, which I can scale at different effects, it will look more broken up. And I might use that. It will look more like a crayon, more like a Conte, more like a pencil. And I can play with exactly how much I want. How much texture, how much variation in pressure. Now, I believe you need a very consistent tool. So that's what I like to use. What I don't like about the texture one is it pretends like you're drawing on a canvas. And so I don't try to have the scale too high, otherwise it becomes really obvious that it's just filling in a preset texture for you. And you can play with all of these different options. A dual brush is kind of mixing two different brush dynamics together. So you can have kind of a secondary brush. Color dynamics is if you have foreground and background colors like this, blue and black, I can actually jitter between them. So as I paint, it will actually mix those foreground and background colors together